rather different from the Wallace ones we talked about before. Because in this case, historians have been as guilty, if not more guilty, of perpetuating and originating these legends than any other writers. So, here's Charlestown's lovely house, Down House, just to remind you where we are at this point in the story. Darwin is retired from busy, dirty, stinky London life and is living quietly with his family in his country house. And, as you know, is very wealthy, he doesn't need to work, he has no job, there is no such thing as a pressure to publish or parent. That was utterly unimaginable in those days. And what was he working on? He was working on all of those materials that he brought back from the Voyage of Eagle. But in the meantime, he was, in the background, he was also working on his theory of evolution. Now, for many, many years, it has been widely believed, simply it has always been stated as simply a fact, that Darwin didn't publish his theory for 20 years because he was afraid of what would happen. He was afraid of what people would say. And there are many subversions of this explanation. So, for example, many people write that Darwin was afraid of upsetting his religious wife. He was afraid of, supposedly afraid of offending Captain Fitzroy from the Beagle days. He was supposedly afraid of creating social unrest in the entire country. He was supposedly afraid of destroying his reputation. He was supposedly afraid of the reaction of the church. Many explanations, which are all have been put forward to answer the presumed question which should come first, which is the presumed one is that why was he afraid? Why was he holding back in fear? And all of these explanations do not apply. So just to give you a flavor of some of this, here's a couple of very short video clips. This one's from Desmond and Moore out there.
Joined forces to write a new biography of one of the most influential and controversial scientists ever, and to solve a long-standing puzzle. Why did Darwin delay publishing on evolution for 20 years? The figure who began to emerge was a man racked with fear and anxiety, a man far removed from the fearless visionary the world of science had fated.
So that's the picture that was put forward by historians Desmond and Moore. Here's a more recent one called, I love this title, Darwin's Darkest Hour. American PBS.
Many years, he has suppressed his greatest work, wary of public reaction, of scientific scrutiny, of religious differences with his wife, Emma.
I think I may have found the answer to the mystery of mysteries. And if I'm right, then the God that Lyle believes in so profoundly is dead.
And what of the God that I believe in?
Now, in the midst of personal tragedy.
It is scarlet fever.
I'm so desperately worried. What with Eddie so sick and now the baby, I think it may prove too much for Charles.
On the verge of professional triumph.
Millions of small changes, the same kind over millions of years.
The danger in what you say is that it undermines the truth of Scripture. It's an axe to the root of the faith by which men lead their lives and which sustains our whole society.
Darwin must make a critical decision, and the world's most controversial scientific theory hangs in the balance.
I think you must publish.
You'd be sorry to see me an object of hatred. Just think very carefully.
Darwin's theory of evolution hangs in the balance, right now, on this National Geographic special presentation.
Yes, yes, very classy and professional. But of course, I hope that from now on, whenever you see a historical documentary or film, that you will just expect that all the dialogue is laid out, like it is in this one, 100% invented. But it seems so plausible. You see them there in the period costume and so forth. It's as if you really are watching Charles Darwin and his wife. In fact, you're watching two late 20th century actors, or in 21st century actors, speaking made-up dialogue by an American writer.
We move then to the third film. So the first two illustrate Darwin's naturalism, its concept of a purposeless nature. The second indicates the non-progressive character of the process, which of course makes human beings not rulers by right over this earth. That's what it's really about. Now the third issue, why the delay? Why did Darwin wait so long? Why did he wait 20 years? Now obviously, but different way. The old view, what I call the optimistic, unrealistic view, held that he always knew exactly what he wanted, but he was collecting data assiduously. It just took him 20 years to get all the proofs he needed. That would be lovely, a nice mythology, but you look at Darwin's life, clearly not so. What was Darwin doing during those 20 years? His main activity was to spend 8 years writing a 4-volume taxonomy of barnacles. Now, I was a systematist by profession, those were very valuable works. But look, folks, you don't have to be Freud to understand that when someone's sitting on what he knows to be the most important and radical notion in the history of biology, you don't spend 8 years working on the taxonomy of barnacles. In the middle of it, that's called displacement activity by anyone. Darwin was not afraid. That's the point I'm getting at. Let me just read you.
Okay, I'll just stop right there with his conclusion. Darwin's obviously afraid, and that is the explanation put forward by Gould there. And most other writers would say that that's the explanation. Darwin was afraid because his theory was likely to be very controversial. So this is the front of the American Museum of Natural History's wonderful Darwin exhibition, which had sort of a rotating blurb text about Darwin and evolution and so on. One of the things that they chose to say there in big bold letters to a public audience about Charles Darwin, one of the things about him that makes him stand out, for 21 years he kept his theories secret. And not to be outdone, our own Natural History Museum in London made this poster for their Darwin exhibition, Darwin Big Idea. Look at that picture. Do you think that's genuine? No. This is called Photoshop. That is not Darwin's hand. But without any text, they know that their audience is already familiar with what this means. Darwin is keeping a secret, because that's what his whole life is about. He's got this secret, controversial theory which he dare not tell you. What I'm going to argue today is that this is a mid-20th century invention that has nothing to do with Charles Darwin, or his theory, or its reception in their original context. But everyone thinks that's what happened back then. Everyone. That's very, very widespread. So, let's start with tackling this. This is the first page of Darwin's Origin of Species, when he first begins to tell the public about his theory of evolution. I've shown you this before. One interesting thing is that he says, right here on the first page, to all of his readers, the history of his theory. In other words, I was puzzled by things during the voyage of the Beagle. On my return home, it occurred to me in 1837 that I might make something out of this question. Well, we now know that date's true because we've seen his notebooks and so forth. He really did start thinking on it in that year. And he thought that by patiently accumulating facts and so on. And he wrote a short sketch in 1842, a longer sketch of his theory he wrote out in 1844. And then he says, from that period, that is 1844, from that period to the present day, I have steadily pursued the same object. That's a Victorian way of saying, since then, I have been working on it. That is what he said on the first page. Now, he may be lying, or he may be too embarrassed to say that he was afraid. Although, if he was afraid, he actually, and you think he might get some more sympathy from his readers by saying, look, I was really very reluctant to share this, but instead he says, I came up with this idea, I've been working on it for all this time, and here it is. So we don't see that there. But I think the thing that should really make one doubt this whole idea of Darwin being afraid and holding back his theory for many years is the fact that this idea just has never appeared in the literature about Darwin until very late. So from the date of his book coming out, 1859, until the 1940s or 50s, no writer ever mentioned that Darwin delayed or postponed his theory. Not anyone who knew him, nor the generations of writers after them. They told his life story in a different way. But that poster I showed you with the Photoshop hand, the public that saw that picture knows a different story from the generations before. Now everyone knows about things that Darwin kept secret. The most important sources are those by Darwin's son Francis, who did this amazing 3-volume life and letters of his father after his death, and then another 2-volume version in 1903, and then this, which is the 2 early essays by Darwin, the 1842 and 1844 essays compared with the early. So he published his father's early essays in 1909 with the discussion about how they differed from the origin and so forth. That would be a really likely, plausible place to mention why there was a big gap between these early essays and the origin. And it's just not addressed. His son doesn't say anything about it. Why? Because there was nothing to say? Or he was covering something up? Well, for the first time I came across anyone mentioning this topic, I was actually doing research on a completely different question. I wanted to know where the legend came from that Darwin discovered evolution when he saw the beaks of the finches. Historians knew long before, since the 1980s, that wasn't true. And the question that struck me was, well, if it's completely groundless, how come everyone in the world came to hear of it? I really wanted to know how that happened. And so I was reading every biographical account of Darwin I could find, books, magazine articles, encyclopedia entries, just anything. From the time he died all the way up into the 20th century to see how the story changed. And in the midst of looking for finch beaks, which is all I was interested in, no beaks here, no beaks here, and so forth. And it just occurred to me when reading this one by Julian Huxley, the grandson of our Thomas Henry, that he made a sort of passing suggestion that maybe Darwin was afraid of upsetting his scientific colleagues. It's a totally uninteresting sentence, but it struck me. Whoa, wait a second. Nobody's made any reference to this delay until this late date that I've read. No one had given any account of it or even mentioned that it existed, that there was a delay. And here's someone saying, oh, maybe it was fear of upsetting his colleagues. So this was clearly the beginning of something that hadn't existed before, a new way of telling the story. But by 1974, we've got the full-on Darwin's delay, which is addressed by this psychologist, and I put that in bold and italics, okay? Howard Gruber's, which is an excellent book, Darwin on Man from 1974. But I stress a psychologist, not a historian. That will become clear very soon. So in brief, what he said was Darwin must have postponed publishing his theory because he was afraid, because of fear. And this is what he came up with. He interpreted, there's a notebook in which Darwin records a dream. And Gruber, the psychologist, interpreted this dream as meaning something different than it literally said. In the mid-20th century, they're all very Freudian and always looking for hidden meanings behind things. And so this was a very good case of that. He thought that this dream Darwin had, in which someone was hung and came back to life, wasn't really about someone else. It was really about Darwin himself being afraid of being hung, being executed. And this interpretation took off and was adopted by most later writers and eventually came to be described as simply a fact. You can find this in loads of books that Darwin once had a dream in which he was executed because of his theory. That's how worried he was. That's how things evolve over time. So here's a couple of clips, but this actually comes on the screen. Figures that were on either side of him were Captain Fitzroy and the anatomist Richard Owen, and that's obviously Darwin with the bag going over his head.
This book will be the death of me.
Oh, this book will be the death of me, he said. And then 2009, this is a documentary.
Fusion, undermining the whole moral and social fabric. Riddled with self-doubt, Darwin was tormented by dreams of being hanged or beheaded. Darwin knew.
Well, oh dear. Very serious. Now let's look at the dream itself as recorded in Darwin's notebook. Look at what it says. September 21st, was witty in a dream in a confused manner, and thought that a person was hung and came to life, and then made many jokes about not having run away, etc., having faced death like a hero, and then I had some confused idea of showing scar behind instead of in front, being changed hanging into his head cut off. There's a kind of wit, showing that he had honorable wounds. All this was a kind of wit. I changed, I believe, from hanging to head cut off. There was a feeling of banter and joking, because the whole train of Dr. Monroe's experiments about hanging came before me, something you remember from his Edinburgh days, showing the impossibility of a person recovering from hanging on account of blood. This is the only source of evidence for this dream story of Darwin being so afraid and so tormented about his secret theory that he thought people would destroy him if they knew he dreamed about being executed. What do you see here in the original? It's quite clearly third person, not himself, and it's in a context of banter and joking and wit. It's a funny dream. He's not afraid. There's no evidence here of fear or of ideas about being persecuted or anything of the kind. Oh, by the way, Gruber gave one other hypothesis about this dream, which did not take off the way the hanging dream idea did, the idea of which was that the dream could also be interpreted as a fear of castration because of the head being cut off. No one picked up that one. That hypothesis just fell dead, and no one ever repeated it. But the fear of being persecuted and hanging thing just took off, and it's still out there today. Very happy. Okay, so going back to original evidence, if you look at the vast number of obituaries that appeared when Darwin died, this is when people started telling the story of the life of Darwin. There are hundreds of these, and by people who knew him or who were friends of friends and so forth. So from the very beginning, the way his life story was told, he went to school here, he went to university here, he was going to be a clergyman, and went to voyage to people, he published this and this, and then he published his theory. There's no delay or any suggestion of delay in the story as it was told by his contemporaries. But some historians have suggested that in his letters he often referred to his theory by this phrase, species and varieties, right? Instead of saying evolution, although people didn't use the word evolution yet, so he couldn't have used that word. But some historians, Desmond and Moore in particular, have said that he used that phrase to hide his meaning, which I find a very silly suggestion, because he planned to call his book, originally it wasn't going to be called Origin of Species, he was going to call it Species and Varieties. Now that's language to hide that you really mean evolution. Why call your book about evolution that phrase? Similarly, when Darwin wrote to colleagues who knew all about his theory, his closest friends, he used that phrase. When he wrote to people he didn't know, he used that phrase. But these historians say when they find the phrase used to a stranger, aha, you see, he's using that phrase to hide what he really means. Well, how can he be hiding it when he uses it in his own notebooks and to his close friends who know what he's talking about? It can't be language to hide what he means. That doesn't make sense. Wallace also used the phrase in the same way. Nobody's ever doubted what he meant by it. This is called special pleading. Secondly, I put together a list of all of these people we can say for certain Darwin had told that he believed in evolution or was working on it during this 20-year gap, which basically includes his family, his friends, his neighbors, his colleagues. At least 50 people. And that's from the tiny bits of evidence that survived. So if we had everything, it would have been, I assume, bigger, because we only have a little bit of evidence. That's a bias. Okay, now this sentence from his autobiography does look like Darwin refers himself to a delay, or I should say a postponement because of some reason. He says, I gained much by my delay in publishing from about 1839, when the theory was clearly conceived, to 1859, and I lost nothing by it, for I cared very little whether men attributed most originality to me or to Wallace, and his essay was no doubt aided in the reception of the theory. So Moore, for example, has said that this is an explicit reference by Darwin to, instead of saying my delay, means my postponement, that long period that I held back. But I think that there are two legitimate ways of reading that word, and we have to decide which interpretation is the best. Now that's one meaning of the word delay. It can mean I gained much by my conscious postponement. That's perfectly reasonable. Or it could mean I gained much by the time that happened to elapse. That's the other meaning of the word delay. Which is it? This is the whole crux of the matter. Well, you know by now which one I think is the most plausible. Look at the phrase elsewhere in the same autobiography. Here's one in another book when he says that I began work on this book in 1868, but it's been published, sorry, 60, I didn't publish it until 68. The delay having been caused partly by frequent notices. So in this case, the delay means the time that happened to elapse due to unforeseen circumstances, merely taking longer than it should have. So, similarly with this one, on his experiments with insectivorous plants. He says, the delay in this case, as with all my other books, has been a great advantage to me, for after a long time you can see your book with different eyes. So, these other cases, they're really unambiguous what it means. Oh, by the way, this is also really good advice for writing if you're a student, isn't it? Don't wait until the deadline to write your essay, because then you don't get time to do what Howard did, which is to write the thing and just set it aside and let it sit and forget about it, so that you can come back and read it again with completely fresh eyes. You can vastly improve what you did if you do that. I do that. I do it over and over again before I publish something. Every time I get to improve my writing. But then again, I know it's difficult when you're students and deadlines. And Darwin didn't. Okay, now here's the other point I would make, which is that a long gestation is typical for Darwin's works. Notice something and think about it for a while, and later you would move on to it. So let me give you some examples. Now remember, the point we're talking about is that the publication of The Order of the Species in 1859 is 20 years after 1839, when the theory is pretty much sketched out. Most of the things are there. So look at this book. He has his inheritance theory, which I'll cover in another lecture, called Pangenesis, was not published for 27 years when it appeared in this book. His orchid work, which he began also in the 1830s, same time as the evolution theory, he didn't publish this until 1862, which is about 30 years after starting to work on this subject. All of these books I will go into in later lectures, just making the point now. And you can check any of these through the links, so you can go straight to the original publication. So the notes on his son's development as a baby were not published for 37 years. Oh, by the way, I've heard it said, I don't know if it's true, it might be, that the craze of having little notebooks to record your baby's first this, that, first smile, first poo, first cry, or whatever, all those things, apparently that supposedly that craze was started by Darwin. Because he did all this in his notebook, and then later published this article showing how a human being slowly develops various things in a certain order and so forth. He tried blowing on baby's face and so forth. Well, anyway, experimenting on children is not so popular anymore. Then this one, cross-fertilization in plants. Again, this work started much earlier. The book did not appear for 37 years. And best for last, his work on earthworms, which he started in the late 1830s, did not appear until 42 years later. No one has ever suggested that any of these other books were delayed or postponed consciously by Darwin. And then all of them came out after a much longer period of time than The Origin of Species did. Now, when you put the book we're all more interested in, Origin of Species, in the context of the books from the rest of his life, actually, there's nothing unusual. In fact, there's less of a gap between thinking of the idea and publishing a book in the case of Origin of Species than all these others. So when you put something in context, when you take something out of context, it seems extraordinary, as when Stephen Jay Gould said, now when you've got the most important theory in the history of biology, you don't work on barns instead. That's just ripping it out of context and looking at it from a modern perspective and not taking seriously what was actually going on at the time. Okay, this, I pose to you, is the most convincing evidence that's ever been brought forward that Darwin was afraid. This is a very famous letter that has been republished countless thousands of times. In fact, I saw it flashed by my Facebook feed last night because somebody had published a picture of the letter on the website or something. Again, this letter is really famous because it's got the line that everyone likes because it's so dramatic. And this is it. He's writing to his to a colleague named Hooker, who would later be his best friend, but at this time he barely knew him. They'd just been writing for I think 2 months. So he tells Hooker what he's working on. At last gleams of light have come, and I'm almost convinced, quite contrary to the opinion I started with, that species are not, it's like confessing a murder, immutable. That means they are not unchangeable. In other words, I think species change. What does it mean? It is like confessing a murder. Does that mean that what I'm about to say is so horrifying that it's as bad as telling you that I've committed a murder? That's the way people interpret it now, and have for a while. In fact, this is also the title of several books on Darwin, because people would love the story to be as dramatic as possible. It's like confessing a murder. In fact, I gave a talk about this whole delay issue in a museum in Denmark once, and I think it was the director or somebody hired from the museum gave a talk for me in Danish, which I don't speak, and shown the cover of her new book. And then I got up and ridiculed the idea that this was about fear, that it was obviously just a joke. And I was told later that the title of her book in Danish was Like Confessing a Murder. And she was my host, but I was a bit embarrassed. My friend who told me this, he said, don't worry, I actually enjoyed it because I don't like her very much. So that's how things work in the scholarly world. Okay, now let's look at this. Let's look at this seriously. One important point is, this is an old letter by Darwin. Okay? How long has it been known and talked about? Answer, it was first published in that Life and Letters by Darwin's son in 1887. So it's been in the public domain before the world since 1887. But it's not quoted and stressed and emphasized for many, many decades after that. In other words, there's no evidence that people read it in the modern way. Why not? They must have been reading it in some other way. I think because it's just typical Darwin humor. And there's nothing sinister about it at all. And all the people who knew him, and even the generation after them, attributed no particular significance to this line. Whereas now it is held up as the great proof of just how terrified, how awful it was to come up with a theory of evolution. It's like murder. That's the way people talk now. But, oh yes, actually this is the one that just came from Facebook. Yeah, so anyway, you can follow the link if you want. So, here's another letter about his book Insectivorous Plants. You asked about my book, and all that I can say is that I'm ready to commit suicide. Because blah, 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 blah. Now, is that literal? Of course not. It's a joke. It means the book's driving me crazy because it's been so much work. This is what you say to a friend in a private letter. Here's other instances of murder or death. I suppose that any remaining birds must be killed and eaten, but I feel that this is something like murder. This is killing his own pigeons. I agreed to say that the plant looks more unhealthy. If it dies, I shall feel like a murderer. Literally? Of course not. I forget that I ever told you that I had long considered the Scotch deerhound the mongrel par excellence. But don't tell any Scotchmen so, or I shall be murdered. Again, hyperbole, over the top. And to another friend, may all your theories succeed except that on oceanic islands on which subject and I will do battle to the death. Of course not literally. And my favorite of all, when I saw your bundle of observations, there's somebody who sent Darwin too many notes. In other words, he had made too many notes as a favor for Darwin. Darwin was embarrassed that the man had gone to so much trouble. And this is what he wrote. When I saw your bundle of notes, I felt as if I had committed theft, arson, or murder. This quote is 100 times stronger than the famous, it's like confessing murder, telling you that I'm working on evolution. Here he's not confessing. Here he actually feels as if he has committed theft, arson, or murder. It's just a joke. It's obvious Darwin humor. Typical language. Nothing unusual. But if you take one quote out of the context of his life and single it out and hold it up, its interpretation is suddenly much more open and can be apparently reasonably interpreted in many more ways. Which is why it's always important to refer back to as much original evidence as possible. Okay, let's look at how he treated things that really were unambiguously secrets. Here's some gossip to a colleague. I had a very long interview with Owen, which perhaps you would like to hear about, but please repeat nothing. He underlined it twice. Under the garb of great civility, he was inclined to be most bitter and sneering. Anyway, he hated Owen and Owen hated Darwin. And so he told his friend, but he said, don't tell anyone. And the convention of those days was that if a letter contained something private, confidential, or secret, you would write private at the top, or maybe confidential. Or you would say, as in that top one, please don't tell anyone this. And yet we have very many letters from Darwin in which he talks about his theory of evolution in this 20-year period, this so-called delay period. Not a single one of them is ever marked private, secret, confidential, and so on. Okay, so Darwin didn't hold back his theory for 20 years because he was afraid of what would happen or afraid of what people would say. What on earth was he doing? Well, as I've been emphasizing in these lectures, Darwin was busy working on his day job, his primary work, which was publishing results of the Beagle voyage. So, he published this 3-volume series on the geology. Remember, he was mostly a geologist during the voyage of the Beagle. He published this 3-volume work. Well, in January 1844, he sent this particular book off to the printers. And then they sent it back, and he had to go through and check that all the type was set correctly. And when he finished that, he had a little gap of free time. And he used that to write up a rough draft or a preliminary sketch of his evolutionary theory before continuing with his publishing projects. And this essay is where the delay theorists really become very, I don't want to use derogatory language, but become very active. And of course, you know, he got married to Emma in 1839, better than a dog anyhow, right? And, okay, this is the essay, which I just photographed in my last visit to Cambridge a couple of months ago. So he writes this really long essay outlining his theory as it then stood. So the question people ask is, well, it's so similar to the origin of species, why didn't he publish it? Or publish a book at this time? I think the answer is that he's already publishing other books, and this is not finished. But let's look at what he did to it, and this is what started me on this whole topic in the first place. This was the little thing that didn't fit, that didn't make sense. That picture on the right is what's called a fair copy. In other words, Darwin's handwriting, as I've shown you, is awful. And nobody can read it, except for a few people. What he did with this essay, which according to so many people is incredibly top secret, and if anyone found out what he was doing, his reputation would be destroyed and all sorts of horrible things would happen, right? What did he do with it? He didn't lock it in a drawer, as a couple of books say, actually. They say he locked it in a drawer and hid it, made up. No, he sent it to the local village schoolmaster who got extra money as a copyist. So he would make a fair, that is to say a pretty or a clean copy of the document Darwin had written. So he paid this man a bit of money to copy out this into what we call a fair copy. Here it is actually, as it is now, bound up in a beautiful leather quarto volume. Obviously, it wasn't like that originally. And there's the first page in the schoolmaster's really pretty handwriting. Like any of you could read this. But this is also interleaved with blank pages between every page, so that Darwin can work on it and add material, because in those days they didn't have cut and paste, except for, of course, to literally cut and paste. But he would put blank paper in between so that you could make a note of this in the margins, like a little X, okay, here insert, and then you could write what you wanted to insert there. And then later on, somebody could make a copy of your whole thing, like a fair copy, and insert all the bits where you want it. So that's what this is. It's a long document with lots of blank pages for further work. And then he wrote this famous memoir. A memoir is a letter that you don't send to the post, because obviously your life is in the same house. But he wrote what is basically like a letter to Emma. This is also incredibly misrepresented in the usual literature, documentaries, and so forth. Many writers will say that Darwin finished this 1844 essay and then wrote a letter to his wife saying, "Only publish this after I'm dead." That's what they say this says. Now you don't need to read, please don't read it all now, because you can read it at any time, but the gist of it is, he says, if something happened to me, I would like this to be published. And here are some people I recommend who would be good editors. And then he offers a massive sum of £500, which is the salary of a really rich man for a year. This much money he offers because, why? Because there would be so much work for an editor to do to put his sketch into a publishable condition. Because what he has just written is not for publication, it's not publishable yet. But should something happen, he wants it to be published, and he offers all of his books and all this money to do the work necessary to finish it off into a publishable state. So the conventional story, we're always told that he wrote out his theory, basically done, hides it, and then writes this letter saying, only publish this after I'm dead. Simply not true. All you have to do is read the original letter itself. It does not say publish this after I'm dead. It says only in case of my death. He is not planning to wait so that he will live out his life in peace and then die and then it will come out. No, that's invented. It's not there. But it sells these stories. They're just so much sexier than the truth. And so they perpetuate and perpetuate. Okay, so let's try to put ourselves in his situation in 1844 to try and understand his thinking and to interpret what he thinks is going on. So this green line I've drawn here on the timeline is basically Beagle work. Work on Beagle stuff, Beagle project things. So all his publications. So at this point in time, Darwin, you can gather from his letters and so forth, that he projects that he will still be working on Beagle stuff till around there. That's what he imagined. Well, I've got a few more years to finish these books and then that article and those other books. So that's what he imagined. He would finish his Beagle stuff here, and then he says, I'll finish this, and then hooray for my species work. When I finish the Beagle stuff, hooray, I will move on to the species theory, which at this point in time you imagine was going to be around here. You see what I'm getting at? At the time, when people say he wrote out this sketch and hid it because he was afraid, he had just written it in a gap between books and was planning to work on it as soon as he finished all this other Beagle stuff, which he had not yet finished. I think it's actually a convenient place to pause for your 5-minute break, and then we'll carry on with some messages flashing. Remember, this is a book on evolution. If the book be true, the labors of sober induction are in vain. Religion is a lie. Human law is a mass of folly and a base injustice. And morality is moonshine. And man and woman are only better beasts. I cannot but think the work is from a woman's pen. It is so well dressed and so graceful in its externals. Now, this is not published, this is a private letter, but the point I'm making is that a lot of scientists, Darwin's friends and colleagues, this is one of his mentors at Cambridge, loathe this book. And what people say nowadays is, that was an evolution book, Darwin was working on an evolution book, so it's the same. Is that valid? I would argue that no, it is not valid. Darwin regarded the work of Vestiges, as did so many of his colleagues, as amateurish kind of rubbish, basically. I mean, it's a nice, popular coffee table book, but it's not serious science. And the fact that it's getting bashed is, well, too bad. It's full of mistakes. Darwin regarded his own work, however, as a work of very serious science, and that he was convinced he could prevail. To say that Darwin equated the two is ridiculous. That was a popular book by an anonymous hack. He is one of the most respected members of the scientific community. The theory of vestiges, this is Darwin's opinion. Darwin would say that theory is silly. Mine is powerful and convincing. The fact that a silly, superficial theory gets bashed is not a reason for you to think that your serious, powerful one will be, is it? But that may not be entirely convincing. How about this? This is what Richard Owen wrote. This is a different view from Sedgwick, and I'm always talking about people bashing messages. But here's the great anatomist, Richard Owen, writing to the anonymous author who has sent him a copy. He doesn't know who it is. He writes a letter which he sends to the publisher. And we'll look at this completely different perspective from what Sedgwick is writing. This is the discovery of the general secondary causes concerned in the production of organized bees. Oh God, Owen is such a mouthful. It really was long-winded. Anyway, upon this planet would not only be received with pleasure, but is probably the chief end which the best anatomists, he thinks he's the best, which the best anatomists and physiologists had in view. In other words, secret author of Vestiges, this is a very noble question, which the greatest minds of the age, i.e. me, are working on. Very noble question, right? There's none of this bashing religion is moonshine, morality will go out the window, and so forth. So there is, as always, there's a big variety of opinion. That's not to say that it's a free-for-all, it has equal distribution. Most people in the scientific community think Vestiges is silly, and that it's absurd, and they bash it. Some think it's very respectable. Darwin thinks it's full of mistakes, and nowhere close to his own work. And here, one I don't have a slide for this, but the absolute, I think, nail in the coffin about the proposal, the suggestion that Vestiges and the bashing that it got put Darwin off publishing his own work is simple chronology. Darwin wrote out that sketch of his theory in 1844 and set it aside on his shelf. He wrote a letter to his wife about what to do in case something happened to him, and then continued on with his Beagle books before Vestiges appeared, before Vestiges was published. So Darwin had written out that rough sketch and carried on with his Beagle work. So to say that the reception of Vestiges is why he carried on with Beagle work is simply wrong. That book hadn't even come out yet when he had already made the decision to continue working on his day job, all that legal stuff that he still had yet left to publish. Oh, and I wanted to remind myself to explain to you this term that Owen uses here, because this will come up a lot in the literature from the Victorians that you'll see in this course. Does anybody know what secondary causes are? Can you guess? Maybe someone will guess that they're the second cause after the first cause and before the third cause. It's actually not wrong. Secondary causes meant, it was based on, this goes back to ancient philosophical and Christian tradition. The idea was that the first cause of anything in the universe, the first thing to change anything, or to move anything, or to make anything was God. So God was the first cause. So secondary causes were things that were not directly done or intervened with by God, but were things that worked on their own. We would say now laws of nature. So when Darwin or Owen or any of these figures uses the word secondary or secondary causes, that's what they mean. They mean laws of nature that work by themselves. So famously discovered by Newton, with his law of gravity and planetary motion and so forth. That was a famous case in which people had once thought that the only way the planets and so forth can go around is that angels with really big wings on their backs are pushing those planets around, all the way around the Earth, and they can never stop, because if they stop, the angels stop pushing, the planet would stop, or the moon would stop, or whatever. In other words, the idea was there had to be active intervention, continuous supernatural cause to keep that thing occurring, happening in nature. But after Newton, everyone accepted, because of his discovery of the regularity of the mathematical laws underlying the phenomenon, that it was a law of nature that things work in this way without the need to intervene. So God or angels don't need to push them around because nature has been made in such a way that they go around by themselves. Those were secondary causes. Lyell had done the same thing with geology. The Earth and all its complex history was one of secondary causes, according to him. Okay, so another one of my diagrams. I'm very proud of these, but anyway. So here's the Beagle thing. So here's another estimate from a year after the one I showed you before. You can see that the Beagle work is actually now a bit closer this way. He was originally thinking it would end around here, you see. But now after a year of work, he's got a better estimate. He thinks he'll finish around, say, 1847, and then he's going to start the species work, which he says somewhere else would take about 5 years. So if you put that 5 years on top here, you would say, so in November 1845, right here, he was thinking his evolution book would come out here. When did it really come out? Here. Okay. Now this is what he foresaw. So the following year he finished his 3-volume geology of the voyage of the Beagle, and I just explained this a few seconds ago. Okay, so only one thing was really left of the Beagle materials. Remember I told you he gave the collections away to experts of different areas. So he gave the birds to a bird expert, the reptiles to a reptile expert, and so forth. What he didn't give away were the geological specimens, so he was the expert, and the marine invertebrates, also they are the experts. He was going to do the volume on that for his wonderful series, The Zoology of the Voyage of the Beagle. Unfortunately, the government funding ran out, as it so often does, and he could never do that book. So instead he published articles on his materials. Then basically one thing remained left to do. He saved the best for last. Barnacles! You just all titillate with excitement, don't you, at the very idea of working on barnacles. Wow! Hot stuff, right? No, of course. As Stephen Jay Gould even mocked the idea that Darwin spent so much time working on barnacles. But again, this is an ahistorical way of thinking so far removed from Darwin himself, the real man. Remember, ever since his Edinburgh days, his first student days, he was most interested, in biology, in marine invertebrates. These simple things that live in the ocean. They've always been his primary area of interest. During the Beagle, he had taken more notes on that topic than any other biological topic. It's not a sideline. This is his hobby. This is what he's interested in and what he's good at. So, he later explained this. I think this is from his autobiography, which you can always check out Darwin and see if I'm wrong. He said, to understand the structure of my new botanist barnacle, I had to examine and dissect many of the common forms, and this gradually led me on to take up the whole group. So the question is, Darwin originally thought he was going to write a couple of articles, and then ended up spending 8 years publishing 4 books on barnacles. Basically, he wrote the world's classification of barnacles, which still stands to this day as the standard work on barnacles. It's different to do that from a couple of articles. And so it's of interest to know, when did he change his mind? Because many people say that, oh, well, the only reason he did that long 8-year project was to avoid doing the species theory, to avoid working on evolution. He got stuck in the barnacles where he could put it off and feel safe. Other people say that he did the barnacle thing in order to bolster his reputation, so that people would take him more seriously. So these are all very nice suggestions, and they appear in almost every book and article on Darwin. Important to emphasize that they are made up. They are just hypotheses that have no evidence for them. Now, the reputation bolstering thing, it sounds plausible, but there is no evidence for it. And indeed, I would say there is no need. Darwin already had an outstanding reputation. So let's, okay, and since most of you will probably not know what barnacles look like, I'm going to get little pictures down here. You must have seen these on the seaside, these little incrustations on rocks and also on boats and ships and buoys and, right? Yes? You know what barnacles are, right? Here are some of his slides, still preserved in the Zoology Museum in Cambridge, because his work on these involved a great deal of work with the microscope, because he had to dissect them in order to study their structure, in order to know which groups to classify, all known barnacles. Now for Darwin, who spent the last 10 years, this is the naturalist from the Voyage to the Beagle, remember what we're talking about. This is the young man who used to go galloping along the pampas with pistols in his belt and eating steaks under the stars of gauchos and so forth. He's been sitting in his study for 10 years writing books. He's actually quite relieved to be working with his hands again, even if it's only on stinky, rotting barnacles under a microscope, which they are pretty smelly, by the way. I mean, they're preservative, but under the microscope they're right next to your nose. Not pleasant, but anyway, he was used to it. So he started to make lots of discoveries about them, and he was very excited about the work for the first couple of years. It was great stuff. His old hobby, his old interest, he's making new discoveries, he's making landmark progress, which will ultimately become these volumes, which he worked on in these 8 years between 47 and 53. And they're dedicated to the 2 main kinds of barnacles, the stalked barnacles. The other name for these, by the way, the popular name for these is goose barnacles. Can you guess what, right? It's another one of these old European folkloric explanations. Okay, why are they called goose barnacles? These like goose? That's a good guess. They look beak-like. Apparently, they also look an awful lot like the scaly leg of a goose. And this is combined with an old folkloric idea that nobody knew, because geese are migratory. So people didn't know where they came from. And they saw these sort of goose-leg-looking things on the seashore. So they thought, in the Middle Ages and so forth, they thought that geese came out of these. People used to believe crazy stuff. And Wallace heard legends in Southeast Asia that there were many places who believed that humans could turn into crocodiles. Or was it the other way around? Humans could turn into crocodiles. There have been countless thousands of such myths and legends in the history of the world. Humans turning into things, or other animals turning into each other. So to have a barnacle turn into a goose is actually no big deal for those times. The other ones are called acorn barnacles because they roughly, well, they don't, somehow they look like an acorn. And these are the ones you're probably most used to. Then he did 2 slim volumes on all the fossil barnacles that were then known. Okay, now, barnacles, you might think, let me move back actually. You might think that these little things are related to clams. And mussels, right? They have shells and they're stuck to rocks, right? That's what everybody thought, until shortly before Darwin began working on them, when it was discovered that they were not mollusks. They were not like clams. They're in fact a type of crustacean, because their larval form is a free-swimming little creature that swims in the sea, which looks like this, and which was classified because it resembles so closely, in so many points of detail, crustacean. So a barnacle is in fact a type of the family of crustaceans that, after swimming freely in its youthful phase, settles down on some hard surface like a rock or the bottom of a ship and glues itself down and then secretes this shelly housing over itself to protect itself, and then can open it, and it puts out a foot, which gives their name cirripede in reverse to the foot. And they grab little bits of junk which they eat. It's junk tasting. And that's what barnacles are. They are crustaceans glued to their backs with a house sealed over them. They can never move again and eat with their feet. They're pretty amazing creatures. Anyway, so this had just recently been discovered that they are crustaceans, and Darwin then did this original work. Well, let's look at Owen again. Owen, in this important book called The Nature of Limbs, looked at why there were all these, it's very famous about these great similarities between different kinds of living things. Right, like the same number of finger bones in us and a cat and a whale, for example. Things that are just totally different creatures. Why do they have all these similarities? Well, this is Owen's drawing, in which, again, you might think evolution is being discussed here. It's not. Owen was, at this time, definitely not, well, he was not an evolutionist. He's had complicated views. Anyway, he had this theory of archetypes, in which he thought that the plan of living things were based on an archetype, which is to say a kind of original idea. Obviously, Owen was thinking an idea in the mind of God, that because there is this original plan for animal types, that the creations that have happened subsequently throughout the history of the world have been based on that idea. And that's why you see the same plans or types expressed again and again, according to Owen. It's a very clever idea. But Darwin, in his barnacle work, because he has his own theory of evolution, of common descent, things changing over time and being related to each other through genealogy, of course does not accept this archetype idea. Darwin would say that the reason things have these resemblances is from actual genealogical relationship. And this is, although he doesn't come out and talk about evolution in the barnacle books, that is the way he arranges things. And he does make some amazing comments that do sound remarkably like assuming that evolution is true. So, anyway, the thing that really kicked him off was that, kicked off his study of barnacles, was that he found these creatures he called complemental males, which, by the way, to males in the lecture data is not a compliment, as you will see shortly, because there were these, this bizarre species of barnacle which he found in the Chonos archipelago, which is where he killed the fox with the hammer. That the male was utterly different from the female. In fact, for a long time he thought it was just like some kind of parasitic flea or something in the female's bodies, and he would just sort of flick them out with a needle as it rather than junk. So that he could study the body of the female barnacle. So, anyway, he then later realized that these little things were actually the males of this species. They were sort of burrowed into the body of the female like a tick, just sucking off her blood and juices and hanging on for the ride, basically. And so Darwin, let me show you a picture of one. It's quite bizarre. Here's one of these little males sort of stuck into the body of the female. So now it must also start out its life as a free-swimming little larvae, and then finds a nice big female, because look, she's vastly bigger than the male. He burrows into her flesh, and then sort of loses everything. You don't need legs, you don't need eyes, you don't need a shell. All you need is a sexual capacity and to provide services for the rental of a nice home. So basically, they're like little sex slaves. And females could actually have more than one. Lots of Darwin called them little husbands, because that was sort of the more polite Victorian way. Obviously, you would say sex slaves, because that's a modern joke. Anyway, so these little sex slaves, what are they? Most barnacles are hermaphrodites. They are both male and female. Here is one where there is a specialized male sex. And it seems to be quite a primitive, early version of sexual diversity. And this was for Darwin, probing at some of the most profound questions about life on Earth and about the origins of why life on Earth. I'm sure I told you it's obsessed with sex. Why does it exist? And here's a good one. Here's, it seemed that you have hermaphrodites that were gradually becoming two-sexed. And for Darwin, it was almost like a snapshot from ancient time. Here we see the process of sexuality, of two sexes emerging from an earlier time when they were hermaphrodites. Why is it happening? There must be some advantage. So, that's so much for complemental males. Okay. Unfinished business. So, Darwin, writing in his autobiography, is telling the story of his life. He says, well, at that time, when he wrote that big sketch I've been talking about, I overlooked one problem of great importance. This problem is the tendency in organic beings descending from the same stock to diverge in character as they become modified. In other words, the tendency for living things to diversify into many species. So Darwin later realized that this is something that he had not yet adequately explained in that early sketch. He later came up with what he called his principle of divergence to discuss this, and this is what some of the Wallace conspiracy theorists think that he took from Wallace, which, as I told you last week, he didn't. Number two, Darwin described in his notes in 1848, so in the very middle of this period we're talking about, Darwin always kind of exaggerated and used over-the-top language. He's always in his notes talking about something being the biggest problem for his theory. There are lots of the biggest. It's just his way of talking. Anyway, so the greatest special difficulty I have met with was this one. And then he described it in The Origin of Species as a special difficulty which at first appeared to me insuperable and actually fatal to my whole theory. It's a silly exaggeration, but he tends to be humorous in an exaggerated way, because it's not, but that's the way he likes to put it. I allude to the neuters, or sterile females in insect communities. For these neuters often differ widely in instinct and instruction from both males and females, and yet being sterile, they cannot propagate their kind. I hear you saying, or I hear you thinking, because you're not saying anything. What the hell does that mean? He's referring to sterile things like bees and termites. Right? We have these huge colonies of sterile workers that don't have sex. They don't have offspring. And for Darwin, this was a big problem with his theory, when everything was about a struggle for existence and only those who have the best attributes can pass on their characteristics to their offspring. Well, how can that work in these huge insect colonies where they don't pass on anything? That was a tricky one. But eventually he decided he'd come up with a solution. In November 1854, it's very similar to what we would now call kin selection. In other words, that he realized that he was talking about families. Each colony is a family. In fact, this is one of my personal asides, so don't note this down. Well, note it if you want. Why do we say queen bee or queen ant? Does anybody know? I don't know. But somebody should find out why. Because it's the mother. It's the mother of the whole colony. She lays all the eggs. All the ants or bees, they're all daughters, some sons of this mother. Why do we say the queen? The queen isn't the mother of everyone in the country, God forbid. So why don't we say that for bees? I don't know the answer to that, but there's, I'm sure, some interesting historical reason why they're called queens, and all the little males are called kings. So eventually Darwin realized that although all those workers don't reproduce, the queens that do must have the characteristics in them that are passed on or not, depending on how successful they are. In other words, the workers all have the characteristics from her because they're born, they're her offspring. And so the work, the help they do for the colony, although it's not helping them personally, it's not selfishly good for that bee or that ant to die, but by protecting their colony, their relatives are therefore succeeding and carrying on to the future. So that's the solution he eventually reached. But you see, it's a tough problem. He didn't work out everything in 1844. He still had a lot of unfinished business, which is the point that I'm making. Okay, and then here's all my little diagrams put together to show how what really happened came about. How did it come out to be the way it was? So originally, remember, he thought he would work on seasonal stuff around here, and then he would do the species work. Okay? And then he thought, okay, he would do some barnacle work here, and then do the species work. But what happened? Well, the barnacle thing went on, and guess what? Then it went on and on and on. Why? Now these explanations about, oh, it's a way of avoiding or hiding or something like that are totally unnecessary. You have to consider what this barnacle work is. By its very nature of a complete taxonomy, it's a complete list and description of all the species in the world. It takes a long time to do that, but let's say you're not interested anymore. You're 3/4 of the way through. What do? You can't publish the complete, well, 3/4 of the complete list in the book and say this is the incomplete list of barnacles. No, the nature of a complete list is you have to carry on until you finish, until you get to the end. So although Darwin, I told you, was really keen on barnacles in the early days, making all these discoveries and so forth, that didn't last. This 8 years was not because he wanted to do it. After, by about the middle of it, he was damn sick and tired of barnacles. Very much so. He began to hate them with a passion. He wrote to a friend, "I hate a barnacle like no man who has ever lived," which is actually probably true, because who's ever hated a barnacle? But actually no, because then he gives an example. In the next sentence he says, "Even more than a sailor in a slow-sailing ship," because they encrust the bottoms of ships and make them much slower. But he says, "I hate them even more," and he knew them so well, and he smelled their rotten stink every day. I'm sure he did. But he couldn't throw it away, or he couldn't set it aside, or he couldn't stop. He had to carry on to finish this list and publish the stuff. And guess what? The very day that he sent back the last of the barnacles to people who had lent them to him, he got out his species notes and started working on evolution theory again. The same day. You can tell he'd been wanting to work on something more interesting for quite a long time. Barnacle stuff, like all big projects, anyone who's ever done a really big ambitious project, they often take longer than you had first anticipated. I can vouch for this too, and I'm sure many people can. Okay, now this one I've saved for last because it's just the nail in the coffin, I think. This is from the 6th edition of Darwin's Origin of Species, published in 1872. Remember, the first one was 1859. In which he says, people by this time, almost all the scientific community now accepts evolution. So in this edition of his book, he's always answering critics and reviewers and so forth. But one of the things people are saying is, "Oh, come on, you always sound like in your book you write that nobody else believes in evolution. We all do. There's nothing so original about it. What's the big deal? And Darwin's a bit annoyed by that. Come on, when I published my book, the rest of you didn't believe in evolution. That's why I'm writing like this. So he answers this by pointing out that, no, you didn't all used to believe in evolution like you're saying now. And here's this evidence for this. I formally spoke to very many naturalists on the subject of evolution, and I never once met with any sympathetic agreement. In other words, Darwin says, I formally, in the old days, before he published his book, I spoke to very many naturalists on this subject, and no one ever agreed. Here it is explicit. Did not keep it a secret. He talked about it with very many people, and he never met with anyone who agreed. And now he's saying, oh, you all say evolution is common sense. It's certainly obvious, and Mr. Darwin kind of exaggerates his originality. He's saying, no, I'm not. That's what this line is for. And here's another one which I found, alas, after I published my article on this subject, which is excellent. I don't know how I missed it. From 1857, he writes to his American friend, the botanist Asa Gray. He tells him 57. Okay, this is 2 years before The Origin is published, almost 3. And he tells him what he's working on. Remember, Victorians being always nauseatingly modest. It is not a little egotistical, but I should like to tell you, I do not think I have, how I view my work. 19 years ago, exclamation point, wow, it's a long time ago, it occurred to me that whilst otherwise employed on natural history subjects, I might perhaps do good if I noted any sort of facts bearing on the question of the origin of species. And this I have since been doing. There it is in his own words. What has happened? I have been working on this for a long time, first in the background, whilst otherwise employed. In other words, this letter, thank goodness, because all the stuff I've been telling you I put together before I found this letter fits exactly what I know I agree, but in Darwin's own words, which is a relief. You all know what happened next. Of course, Darwin's book, which he was planning, would originally have been many volumes, and then Lyell urged him to scale that down and bring it down a bit more quickly. So the scaled down one, we refer to that as the big book. Nobody has a name for the original big one, what would we call it? The massive, giant, table-crushing book, I don't know. But the big book is the one that was interrupted by Wallace. It would have been about 3 or 4, well, who knows, everything expanded in Darwin's hands, so, but at least 3 or 4 volumes. That was put on hold, and then we got The Origin of Species in 1859, as we know. Okay, here's another video clip from Adrian Desmond. Let's see if it plays.
All of the anguish, all of the worry that it would be cannibalised by socialists and Lamarckians, and his natural selection would be a stick to beat the establishment, came to nothing. He worried for nothing.
Were you there?
So, that's Adrian Desmond, Adrian Desmond and James Moore are the 2 biggest proponents of this of Darwin holding back because he was afraid. Desmond's particular angle on this is that if Darwin had published his theory in the early days, these social radicals, these atheists and so forth, would have taken Darwin's evolution theory, and as he just said, it's his favorite phrase actually, has used it as a stick to beat the establishment. He's always got sticks beating the establishment in his writings. Check it out, it's not just me saying that. And that's why Darwin dared not publish. I think his argument is very weak because these social radicals he's talking about, very few people. Darwin probably didn't even know they existed. He's never provided any evidence that Darwin did. Darwin lived in a very different world, with very posh, nice people. Did not hang out with these radical people banging on the doors of the establishment. It's just not Darwin's world. But some of those people believed in a Lamarckian version of evolution. Hence, Desmond thinks that, well, if they use that Lamarckian version, they would have used Darwin's. I don't know, it's not the same. It's completely different theories. And as Desmond then says in this clip, but he spent all those 20 years worrying about this and then nothing happened. I would say because he never dreamed of it. It was never entered Darwin's mind. So, now I'll bring you on to the final part of this, which is my article published in 2007 called Mind the Gap, on this question of did Darwin delay his theory for 20 years? Did he keep it a secret? What's going on in this 20-year period of time? Argued in that what I have outlined to you today. The very late date in which anyone ever talked of such a thing, only in the middle of the 20th century, all of the problems with evidence, all of the questionable interpretations, all of the confidence of these suggestions about barnacles or vestiges and so forth without ever checking, and so forth. And I worked on this article for, I can't remember how many years. I mean, it was almost as much work as for a book in this article. It was my big project. I told you, as I started out stumbling on the idea by working on the Finch peaks, and how should I describe the rest of this? The publication process of my article was not straightforward. I wrote the article, and everyone in the Darwin's scholarly community knew what I was working on. I asked everyone what they thought, what's going on in 20 years and so forth. Where does the idea come from? Please, too much chattering. And I was told by one senior Darwin scholar in an email, don't publish that, because if you do, you should consider the adverse impact it will have on your reputation and career if you lose the support of senior Darwin scholars. Imagine if you just got your PhD and someone wrote you that. I wrote back, I guess when somebody does something like that, you do get a little bit defiant. I wrote back and said, gosh, that sounds an awful lot like a threat. And the senior academic wrote back and said, oh, no, it's not a threat, it's just a warning. You should be aware that serious consequences might befall you if you're so reckless as to publish this awful article, this absurdity that you're arguing. It's just so bad. Yes, so I submitted it to a journal, peer-reviewed, and it was published in Notes and Records of the Royal Society in 2007. And I sent the abstract of that to the BBC, to Nature, which is the biggest scientific magazine in the world, to my university, this was at Cambridge then, my university press office and so forth. And so just the abstract outlining my argument was very popular, and the story went massive. I was on the news and radio and TV all over Britain, and there were things all over the world. Massive news story. It was great. Yes. Yes! For about 2 weeks, when I got a phone call one morning from one of my senior academic patrons with a tone in his voice that actually, I have to be honest with you, even recalling it right now, sends a shiver of fear. I'm serious, down my spine. Terrifying, terror. A senior academic had written a 20-page diatribe condemning me personally as a person, as well as my article, and sent it not only to my two senior academic patrons, but CC'd it to a vast number of scholars in Cambridge and around the world to maximize damage to my reputation. And guess if it was the same one who wrote me that email. Well, I'll leave that to your imaginations. This was very serious. He claimed that I lied to journalists about describing myself as just rubbish, all sorts of terrible accusations thrown at me, and the article, it was said, should be withdrawn. When my patients eventually stuck up for me and said, John has done nothing wrong, he did some research, he published an article in a peer-reviewed journal, that's his job, he's a historian. And, you know, he didn't, and the other accusation was that I was parading myself in front of the cameras. That's a very nasty accusation as well. It happens to any academic, whoever gets featured in the news, others will sneer and say, oh, look at that person, they're just trying to get attention. When in fact I hadn't even written a press release, or I just simply sent a copy of my academic article. This is not popularization. This isn't a dumbing down story for the masses. This is my peer-reviewed academic research, send it out. You are supposed to do that at the University of Cambridge and other universities. They want you to send your research out to the world so that we don't live in an isolated ivory tower, but that we can just talk to other experts. We're supposed to share the results of our research with others and to tell the public, if they can be bothered to listen, which 99% of the time no one cares what we say, but because I'm writing about famous Mr. Darwin, and it was a dramatic point, it did get lots of attention. So that attempt to undermine, possibly even get me sacked, didn't work. Although the reputation thing, well, I have no way of estimating how much that was. The letter campaign went on and on. Lots of people were told they should never work or cooperate with me again, which did succeed in many cases. Secondly, when that was getting no joy, my critic and another nasty person wrote a letter to the editor of the journal in which they said that my article was unpublishable rubbish. It was a terrible mistake and it should be withdrawn, which is the greatest shame you can experience as an academic, that your published work be officially withdrawn and cancelled. The editorial panel of the journal met to discuss it, and they voted unanimously to uphold my paper. They then invited the two critics, since they felt so strongly about this, to submit an article themselves critiquing my work, which would be peer-reviewed, and then I would be allowed to respond, but my response would also be peer-reviewed. They turned it down. They said that 3,000 words wasn't enough space in which to condemn me. But I can't help but wondering if the original letter to the journal saying they should withdraw my paper was more than 3,000 words. I have a feeling that the letter written in private was actually less than that, and considered enough to get me wiped off the books. But to do so in public was not enough. That I can only speculate, because I'm obviously not privy to other people's thoughts and decisions. But anyway, so that is the dramatic story of the birth of this little article. And the reason I share all of these personal anecdotes with you is because it is an extraordinary example of what can happen in academia if you challenge the orthodox, received conventional views. On the one hand, you're told you're supposed to do this because that's the best thing you can do to make some new discovery. You're supposed to always say what's new in what you're doing, what previous view does it overturn. We are always asked to do this explicitly. But scholarship and academia aren't just these rules. It's not an ideal world. It's a world of, just like science, and the world of Darwin and his peers, it's a world of people and personalities. And all of those things have just as much an impact as a good argument, as a good margin of evidence, and so forth. So sometimes people who have a very good case and a very good argument may never be heard, may never get published. Please, there's way too much chat. Because it is considered by other people to be outlandish or outrageous, or totally ridiculous. Well, often it is. Someone often does come up with a totally ridiculous suggestion or theory. But some of those are genius, are the original new work on which the future of their field or science will be built. How can you tell the difference between a nutter and someone who has a valid new idea that's just simply a new way of thinking that at first doesn't fit with what we know and is not accepted? How can you tell the difference? I don't have the answers to that. I don't know anybody who does. I get emails and theories from nutters around the world all the time, suggesting new theories for the evolution of the universe, and you wouldn't believe I keep them all in a special file. Kind of things I receive, but yeah, that supposedly an expert can set something to an expert, they can assess it and decide whether or not so on and so forth. There simply is no answer or solution to this. There is no way out of all of these questions being things that people do. And their personalities, their egos, which in my opinion is about 99% of all academia, and all these other issues, they are just part of reality. There will never be an ideal system in which we can circumvent all of that. It's always going to be a mess. It was in Darwin's day, and it is still in our day. But that's one lesson I hope you'll learn about science. It's not just a bunch of discoveries by geniuses who figure things out, and that's it. But they're happily ever after. That's it. Okay. That's it for today. So I've got lots.